Have you ever been on set and all your lights suddenly just go out, and it's a mad dash to find the breaker box to reset? If so, you've probably tripped a breaker by overloading the circuit with too much power. We're going to take a moment with this section of the course and walk through power. Everything from what to look for, the different ways you can power your lights, and everything in between. I'm going to try and explain a few terms without getting too technical. To dive right in, power is broken down into three terms: voltage, amps, and watts. I want to spare you the equations and super technical explanations of each and just leave you with the essentials. Voltage. This one is important, but in most circumstances, this only becomes useful at higher levels when dealing with bigger lights and generators. When looking at voltage from your household outlet, this will vary depending where in the world you live. In the United States, our voltage is 120 and you'll have a 110 outlet, and in other parts of the world, they use 220. Like I said, most of you watching don't need to concern yourself with voltage. The more important terms to understand are amps and watts. I mean, if you looked at anything, the back of a hairdryer, a coffee maker, a film light, there is going to be a label that tells you how much power it consumes. And this number is going to be in watts. So for instance, a tungsten 1K requires 1000 watts. That is just the power requirement for that light to turn on. And amps is essentially another way of looking at that. How you arrive at amps is by taking that number of watts and divide by 100. And I know I told you I'd spare you all the complicated equations, but if you can remember just that, dividing the watts by 100 to arrive at the amps, that's an easy way to calculate how many amps a light is using. So when you know the amps that your light requires, you want to deduct that from what you have access to. So if you're plugging into a house, most household breakers are 20 amp breakers. So knowing this, say you plug in a 1K, which is 1000 watts or 10 amps, you would subtract that from 20 amps and you are left with 10 amps, meaning you can still plug more into that circuit until it hits 20 amps. We're also going to touch on a few different options for power, so if some of this is still a little foggy and confusing, stick around and we'll do our best to break it down. When you're shooting in a house, you have to be strategic. A house has 20 amp breakers that are divided throughout the house. You'll have 20 amps in the kitchen, 20 amps in the living room, and so on. You can find out where all your 20 amp breakers are by looking at the breaker box. This is something I'll try and do on the Scout, but if on the day you arrive at the house and you can locate the breaker box, that is a great way to sort of show you where you can pull power from. Never try to max out a breaker either. Always give a little 5 amp or 500 watt cushion. This will prevent it from tripping in the middle of your shot. Your gaffer usually is in charge of power, but in instances where you are in charge, or maybe you're in like a lower budget, scrappier circumstance where you're really the only guy lighting the set as well, make an announcement to all other departments that may be plugging stuff in. More often than not, when there's a trip in the breaker, it's because someone plugged in a coffee maker or a hair dryer. All of these other auxiliary things that productions use also require power. So consider as you're shooting inside a house to not only be cognizant of what lights you plug in, but what other departments might also be plugging in. If you find yourself needing more than 20 amps or just don't want to deal with the hassle of all the different breakers and outlets and rerouting power from the back living room or whatever, a generator is your next option. When would you use a generator? Well, for starters, if you're using a light that requires more power than 20 amps, say for instance a 4K HMI, that's 4000 watts or 40 amps, and a household breaker only has 20 amps, so you'd have to rent a generator to power lights like this. Or another instance, if you're on location, say in the desert, you're not going to have access to wall outlets. So that's when you would use a generator, to power and charge batteries. light up lights, stuff of that nature. And the most popular generators are putt-putt generators. They range from 20 amps all the way up to 60 amps. Something to keep in mind though is cable. We all know what a 3-prong outlet looks like, but as you start to get bigger and bigger lights, they're gonna require bigger and bigger cable. The next tier above a stinger or an extension cable is Bates. Bates is the name of a cable that can carry a heavier load of electricity. So keep that in mind when you put together a larger putt-putt generator, that some of your lights might require 60 amp Bates. A good rule of thumb is these putt-putts, especially the 30 to 60 amp ones, can be really loud. You will want to get these as far away from your scene as possible if you're recording sync sounds. So be prepared to run a lot of cable to your lights, given that your generator is going to be as far away as possible. If you're using a stinger or an extension cable and powering lights under 20 amps, you can only really run about 200 feet of cable. This is something that tripped me up. I had a sound person, a mixer, tell me that my that my generator was too close to set and that it needed to go as far away as possible. So trying to appease him, I pushed the putt-putt all the way down the street, ran cable all the way to the HMI, and the HMI wouldn't turn on. And it was just working before. What this means is I ran too much cable. If you exceed 200 feet of cable, the distance that power has to go through all those extension cables, by the time it leaves, by the time it arrives at your light, it's not carrying as much electricity. Imagine it just going downhill. By the time it reaches your HMI or whatever light you're trying to power, it is not as much power that initially left your generator. So a good rule of thumb is, if you're gonna do one of those things, moving your generator far enough away for sound, try to measure out 4 50-foot stingers. Anything beyond 4 50-foot stingers or 200 feet simply will not work. So keep that in mind if you're using larger HMIs like an M18 or trying to power something really far away, that you can only do about 200 feet runs for whatever you're trying to power to work.